Beg the patriarchy. Hello witches, and welcome back to Activist Witch, where we discuss witchcraft and activism. My name's Raven, my pronouns are they, them, and in this video we're going to be talking about the divine trans feminine. But before we get started, let me remind you that Isha has opened a Ko-fi, and if you like what we do here, you can support us directly there with a one-off donation, a monthly donation, or you can even get a tarot reading with her Italian style. With a low income option starts at £5, so if you decide to support us there, thank you so very much. So the first thing I want to say is that the title to this video is what's been holding me back from making this video for so long. Because I don't think this is about the feminine or the trans feminine. It's a really catchy title because of the divine feminine. So this is the way that we're going to do it. But the title we probably should have gone for is Queering the Divine. Because one of the issues when you bring in things like masculinity or femininity or male or female is the issue we've discussed before about boundaries put around things, defining what's outside them as much as they define what's inside them. I think this issue is pointed out quite well with the idea of the male and the female gaze in cinema and photography.
In feminist theory, the male gaze is the act of depicting women and the world in the visual arts and in literature from a masculine, heterosexual perspective that presents and represents women as sexual objects for the pleasure of the heterosexual male viewer. The concept was first articulated by British feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey in her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Mulvey's theory draws on historical precedents, such as the depiction of women in European oil paintings from the Renaissance period, where the female form was often idealized and presented from a voyeuristic male perspective. Art historian John Berger, in his work Way of Seeing, 1972, highlighted how traditional Western art positioned women as subjects of male viewers' gaze, reinforcing a patriarchal visual narrative.
And basically, the male gaze is defined around voyeurism. It's the voyeuristic lens through which we are viewing art or images. In cinema, it's keeping a male audience in mind and creating images designed for them, to please them. This involves objectifying and sexualizing mostly women. It involves objectifying and sexualizing feminine actors and feminine models. And I think it's something that we've all seen and we can all recognize it and we all know when it's happening. Michael Bay with Megan Fox in Transformers always comes to mind. But then the issue comes in trying to define the female gaze. Because as we've stated before, when you have oppositional and hierarchical binaries, the female gaze must by definition then oppose the male gaze. It must be its opposite in some way. But when you're only talking about something as limiting as objectifying women, sexualizing them, creating images for male pleasure where we are viewing feminine subjects voyeuristically, that actually leaves like a lot of room for what something other than that can be. So if that's the constraints and that's the male gaze, literally everything else in the world is the female gaze. You do sometimes get people describing the female gaze as essentially being the male gaze but for women, where male subjects are objectified. I'm thinking things like Magic Mike with the strippers dancing. You have, one for me would be Alcide in True Blood.
What have I married into?
That's not so much the female gaze as it is the male gaze reversed, where doing a reverse sexism, we're voyeurizing men, we're objectifying men, we're sexualizing men. And at least in arts, in photography, in cinema, that's not what the female gaze means. And kind of as such, the female gaze defies definition because it is anything that is not voyeuristic, that is not objectifying. I think a good example of something I saw recently, which is very female gaze, is I Hate Susie, which was created and starring Billie Piper. A lot of the scenes aren't about looking in on a situation, they're about identifying with the situation, in recognizing those same emotions, in seeing yourself in the characters and seeing yourself in those situations and experiencing those same emotions and feelings that the main character is going through. There's lots of scenes which we all recognize the sense of, the feeling around it even if they are quite exaggerated and outlandish, they're still instantly recognizable to us because of the way that we process our feelings around events. You see where I'm going. It's inclusive, it draws you in, it asks you to take part in the media. That is an example of female gaze. That's not what the female gaze is. And bringing it back to the divine feminine, we kind of have the opposite problem. We've defined what the divine feminine is, or at least the most common aspect of it being the mother maiden crone, in tying divinity and femininity to reproductive capability, which I think we've talked enough on this channel about how problematic and not okay that is. And so I've seen a few attempts then of people trying to define the divine masculine. Our friend Freddie has talked about different festivals that he's gone to, divine masculine workshops, and I think this is all very good work in trying to define masculinity in a way that is outside of the patriarchal lens, that tries to break the mold of the status quo about what men can be and what it means to be a man. However, it still just runs into this problem of we start putting borders around things, we start defining what's inside them, and therefore defining their oppositional nature outside of them. And it keeps leading to hierarchies, and I think we need to do better. You can say that we all have the divine feminineness, we all have the divine masculine in certain parts. It's about yin and yang, it's about Taoism finding balance. But at that point, if we all have both in us, what are we defining them by? Why is masculinity associated with maleness? Why is femininity associated with femaleness? And why have we ascribed those traits through those? We can't escape the associations of thousands of years of patriarchal hierarchy. So how can we do better? And I think a good way to start with that is to define the divine. Because let's face it, most of us living in the West, we're living in a culturally Christian context. We've been brought up surrounded by ideas of God and religion and worship and the separation between humanity and the divine. But as we know as pagans or in the occult, that's not the only way to do things. For many different cultures, the divine are the forces of nature. They're the thing that makes the sun rise in the morning and set at night. They're what brings rain to grow crops. They can mean the difference between eating or having to migrate hundreds of miles to escape drought. These are powerful forces to be reckoned with. And I think the thing that really defines humanity is our attempts to reckon with them, to bend them to our will, to manipulate them to best help us. Sometimes we do that in very practical, material ways, and sometimes we do it in very spiritual ways. This desire, this drive to try and control our surroundings and bring them in harmony, well, not necessarily in harmony, but influencing them to benefit us, to help us survive. Like, it's been a core defining aspect of our species since we learned to communicate with each other. When I think about the Mother Maiden Crone or the Triple Goddess, this idea of a ancient matriarchal society that lived in secret through Christian Europe, through the medieval period, and this hidden underground cult that worshipped the goddess and worshipped the god of nature. What I end up thinking about are the other fertility gods out there. Some of the Egyptian gods. We have male fertility gods, we have female fertility gods, we have fertility gods that are for livestock, fertility gods that are for growing crops. Looking at the links between Demeter as the mother of grain, the mother of wheat, and the Madre Mater, the great mother, the mountain mother. These are important forces. Of course they are. They help us survive, they help us proliferate, they help us keep going as a society, as a species. But they've never been tied down to one specific thing in quite the way that we did with the Triple Goddess, the Mother Maiden Crone. And the Mother Maiden Crone isn't the only example of a three-phase goddess. We have three-phase goddesses for the morning star, for the full moon, for the different phases of the moon, for the seasons. These are also forces that we have to reckon with, we have to work with, we have to respond to, because things in life are always changing. Time's arrow keeps marching on.
All right, believe it or not, time's arrow neither stands still nor reverses. It merely marches forward. This
subject is just so much broader and wider than this small aspect. And I think it's very limiting. It's something we're very much lacking in the occult and witchcraft community, that we're still attaching ourselves to this very small way of looking at things. Especially when it's for something that, it's huge, like the phases of life, reproduction, our status within society, our status within family. These are all very large topics, but they can also be so much more than we're making them. As we talk on this channel about the opposite of capitalism being community, so something that comes to mind for me is the Family Code referendum in Cuba in 2022.
A referendum was held on the 25th of September 2022 in Cuba to approve amendments to the Family Code of the Cuban Constitution. The revised code contains stronger rules on gender equality and modernizes protections for women, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Moreover, legal recognition is given to same-sex marriage and adoption and altruistic surrogacy. Following the code's approval, Cuba's family policies have been described as amongst the most progressive in Latin America. Until 2019, Article 36 of the 1992 Constitution of Cuba defined marriage as the voluntary union established between a man and a woman, making same-sex marriage constitutionally impermissible.
Which sought to expand the definition of the family, so that it's not just by default that the person you're born to or the person that gave birth to you are your parents, which expanded the definition of the family beyond the two parents of opposite sex and their children units that we're all just so used to and we take for granted. Under this reform, it means that gay parents adopting or using surrogacy or IVF or any other of the wonderful ways that we have to bring children into this world to create family will be legally recognized in just the same way. That there is no hierarchy to blood relation. You can even have it so that, if you live in a house full of friends and you want those friends to be legally recognized as your family, there's a way that you can go about that. And one of the, we love each other very much and we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. One of the reasons why Isha and I got married is so that she could be my family, so that we could be each other's family. Because without that, it defaults to my blood relatives. And no offense to my family, but Isha is the one who is around. She is the one who knows me best. She is the one I've built my life with. And I need her to be able to have that recognition in society, so that when it comes to making decisions, about each other, that what's best for us isn't taken over by someone who has a weaker link to what's best. There's issues in Italy right now where they're revoking birth certificates for same-sex couples. So however those families are created, no, birth certificate has to have the biological mother and the biological father. Yeah, even with surrogacy, the person who gives birth to the baby, that's who has to be on it, which removes rights. It removes recognition. And that's horrifying for these families. Imagine you have a child if you don't have one, and imagine something happens to them and you were told that no, you have no right to decide what's best for them in that situation. So, Raven, what does transness have to do with any of this? I'd say the thing that I want to be very careful about here, I don't want to make the mistake of the divine feminine and the divine masculine and come up with some reason why trans women are better than cis women, or that, we have more right to womanhood. Like, I've seen it happen. I've seen it be done. It's unfortunate. Even within religion, there are different opinions on transness. You have some that say that God doesn't make mistakes, and so trans people can't be trans because that would be an instance of God making a mistake. The other side of that is that God doesn't make mistakes, but trans people are real. And so therefore God is subjecting trans people to horror and misery and the discomfort and the displeasure being born in a body that you don't identify with so that you can overcome those struggles. Sounds a bit fucked up. There are other arguments that the transition is taking part in the act of creation in the same way that giving birth is taking part in the act of creation, of creating life. That's, certainly one way of things, but I think it's still it has that issue of trying to create a hierarchy there. It's saying that, oh, I'm special because I made myself. What did you do? Yeah. One of the things I always say is that whether you're cis or trans, something that can be really useful is to stop and take stock of your identity. Just have a look at it. Maybe you haven't looked at it in a while. Maybe it's been pushed under the sofa. Maybe you left your identity in the back of the cupboard and it's been a while since you checked in on it. Sometimes it's really useful to do that, to evaluate, to see how the way you're living, does it measure up to the way society dictated you should live? Do you feel at home in it? Do you feel as home as you thought you felt in it? Or did you just not really think about it? And whatever answer you come to with that, that's a wonderful thing. If you decide that, no, what you've been doing is absolutely correct for you, fantastic. If you decide that, actually, no, maybe it is time for a change, wonderful. There's so many ways you can do that. As long as it's something that you are taking hold of, something that you're owning for yourself. That's the beauty of transition, whether you do anything about it or not. Long before I became a witch, when I first came out as trans, I remember thinking about magic and thinking about spells, and I realized that, at least from my perspective on things, that coming out as trans is very much like casting a spell. You say the magic words, I am a, and you change the past, you change the present, you change the future. You always were, you always are, and you always will be, unless you change it later, which you're completely free to do. But it's just casting another spell. Sometimes spells don't work for us. It's altering reality, it's molding reality to best fit ourselves. And for me in my magical practice, that's everything that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring my desires into the real world. I'm trying to make them manifest. There's another thought that I brought up with Isha a few months ago, probably like 6 months ago now, where I think it was after the Opposites of Capitalism video. And it was a discussion, it was a question that I brought up for us, a philosophical question that I think would be really useful for us to think about and look into and put our thoughts down on what is the purpose of the witch in modern society. We can look into the cunning folk of the 17th and 18th and 16th centuries of what they were doing and the services that they were providing for people, about their place in community, about the job that they were doing for those around them. And a lot of that's been taken over by the material. We have doctors, we have vets, we have chemists instead of alchemists, we have astronomy instead of astrology. So much of the work that we were doing in the ethereal realm has now been brought very much into the material and grounded in there solidly. And so what are witches in this day and age trying to do? Because society is so very well structured around these material institutions. How do we compete with them? How do we not undermine them? When it comes to medicine, how do we not use pseudoscience? How do we not accidentally poison people? And I realized that there is a very fantastic example of the witch in the trans community. And that is the DIY hormone producer, the home brewers, the people who make their own HRT medicine to distribute to the community. And this can seem like a very scary prospect to some of you, I'm sure. But you have to look at it through the lens of necessity. As we discussed in the Illegal Women video, the way that the medical institution is set up around trans healthcare, it's not with the people's best interests at heart. It's there to restrict access. To restrict access as much as possible to ensure that as many people fail to access the care that they need. Things have improved on that front, but even then, the guidelines, the research that's been done around this has been very specifically motivated. Hormones for trans people are viewed as antidepressants rather than as a vehicle for self-actualization. And so in response to that, the community has come up with their own way of doing things. There are fantastic resources online that look at the current research that exists and find the flaws that are in it, that examine exciting new fields whenever someone does try to do things properly or do things the right way. There are certain doctors out there that are pioneering new forms of care and trying to find the best possible way to help the community. It's out there, but all of this is done very anti-establishment-y. It's against the grain. It's against the ethos of the experts that have appointed themselves in charge of this. And sometimes, does it follow the scientific method very rigorously? Not so much, but I think when people are willing to experiment on themselves, then clearly medicine has failed. If they're not going to do it, if they're not going to step up and put in the work that we need, we're just going to do it. As far as a cost-risk analysis goes, hey, a lot of us have nothing to lose. And so with the DIY homebrewers, what they're doing is creating very easy access to the medications that are needed, often made better than pharmaceutical companies will make them. And I'm sure you can think, and I know that I have, of all the ways that this can go wrong. Especially when, in the olden days, the number one form of homebrew HRT that was produced was injectable estrogen. Injectable testosterone has been available through a certain other, it's hard to call them cisgender community, but the ones that like big muscles. But when it comes to making feminizing hormones, injectable estradiol is the one that was cheapest, easiest to make safely, and could be distributed at very low cost. We're talking about $100 for a 2-year supply compared to, I don't even know anymore, it's been so long, how much it costs for your insurance or to pay for prescriptions, or even if you have to buy the medicine yourself privately, those costs add up. And you can look at plenty examples of snake oil salesmen and scams that exist around things like supplements, of magical pills that promise male virility, that are just ginseng and whatever else crap they scraped off the floor, or even like the way that MLMs work right now. But the difference is, it's honestly just been so successful, is that this is something that is community managed. In the community, we know who the reputable sellers are. We know when something goes wrong. We know when there are issues very quickly. It spreads very quickly throughout the global trans community. And we look after ourselves. We keep each other safe. And this is something we've been doing for decades. This has been something we've been doing since the 60s and 70s. When nothing else is there, we step up for each other. So something I forgot to mention in the video that I think is very relevant to this discussion around healthcare and how communities can make their own better healthcare is a discussion that sprung up on one of Silvia Federici's other books, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin. Some trans people have argued that this book reveals Silvia Federici's secret TERF nature. I don't necessarily agree with that. However, in the defense of Silvia Federici, I've seen people go in the opposite direction. So one very interesting review of the book is by Rhyd Wildermuth. And in trying to defend Silvia Federici against arguments of being a TERF, he uses this quote, which I think is very interesting to what we're talking about.
We must then avoid making the medical profession the godlike creators of our bodies, and instead direct our activism to devising ways in which we can exercise some control over our encounters with it. There are many examples of this. In the middle of the 19th century, a popular health movement developed in the US that encouraged people to develop their own medical knowledge, and it looked at official medicine with suspicion as an elite, undemocratic operation.
However, he interprets that as finding alternative treatments to HRT and surgery, herbal supplements, the kind of things that supplement companies do tend to scam us with, the things that as a community we all warn each other against. Personally, I think what Silvia Federici's written much more supports what I'm saying around the community finding their own ways of doing things better due to suspicion, rightful suspicion, around how doctors are mismanaging our treatments. However, in this excerpt,
paradoxically, a testimony to the relevance of difference in our experience of our physical makeup comes from a large section of the trans movement that is strongly committed to a constructivist view of gender identities, as many undergo costly and dangerous surgeries and medical treatments in order to transition to a different gender.
It does speak a bit much more to that culturally Catholic idea where, especially for ex-Catholics, they tend to replace the idea of God is infallible and God is all-powerful and only God can be the arbiter of the body and the soul and the world, and replaces it with the idea of nature, that nature is perfect and should be accepted as it is. And that's something that we also need to be careful of. I mean, this is rhetoric that is repeated through a lot of TERF ideology and a lot of TERF propaganda. But, it is a common trap that a lot of people fall into. And so paradoxically, we do get these quite different ideas coming through in Federici's writing. However, I think, overall, we're aiming towards the same ideals. We're aiming towards the same idea of community and community knowledge and moving outside of authoritarian structures and hierarchies and gatekeeping knowledge that I think we're both against. And I think there are other examples where this could be useful to society. Menopausal women are restricted from HRT in much the same way that transgender women are too. There's this big fear about health risks, about causing cancers, that are because the medical establishment were giving out shitty versions of those drugs. There always were better ways to do it, but there were more profitable ways to do it too. There's lots of stories of HRT shortages where people are sharing their prescriptions around with the women that they know. This is the kind of community solidarity that I think can be built elsewhere in society. And a lot of this is, yes, it seems a bit dodgy. It's all very hush-hush. I'm not naming anyone because I don't want to get them in trouble. But if you know where to go, you know where to go. And it's an issue because when reputable companies want to try and make something, or someone wants to make something legit, the establishment steps in. There are restrictions that are put in place. Something that we discovered very early on is that there are hormone creams that you can buy over the counter that are designed for menopausal women. If you're in the US and you search on Amazon, you'll find product after product after product. I think in the UK it's a little bit harder to get hold of, but it's very easy to buy them from US sellers. However, because they're doing things legit, there are certain ingredients that would help the efficacy of those products that they are not allowed to use, because if they do, they then fall into the realm of medicine and become licensed. There are stricter regulations about what can be done. And that's not the kind of trouble that's worth getting into. And so you can make a more effective product if you keep it on the down low, if you exchange in shady corners of alleyways and under the cover of night. Yeah, I mean, the supplement industry is screwy because they have to fall under food regulations so that they can do what they do. Otherwise, it just becomes so much oversight and overhead. But the thing, they're not allowed to do it right. So how are you going to do it? And again, I want to reiterate, I'm not saying in this video that transness and queerness is necessarily better, but I think it offers a lot of alternative views in certain areas that we could expand. You can queer your life, you can queer your community without being queer. Yeah, I was about to say, it's like, I'm not saying you have to suck a dick. When we have a society that is so structured around the sex binary, around man and woman, husband and wife, father and mother, and that exists on every single level of society because patriarchy, there's so many ways we could change things. There's so many alternate ways that we could approach every aspect of our lives. And I think the queer community, the LGBT community, the trans community are doing a good job of making their lives bearable in the face of that, because that's rough to deal with. And I get that, if you don't have that much of an issue with it, and it kind of seems right, and you're not really forced to think about it or question it that much, hey, why rock the boat? But have you seen the problems? Have you seen the issues out there? Have you looked outside? It's on fire. maybe there's some ways that we can put some of those fires out, and maybe some of the ways that the marginalized have, revolutionized, utilized to help cope with this situation. Hey, maybe they're useful for you too. It doesn't have to be just for us. It can be for you too. Like, you can take all, like, witchcraft itself. Honestly, we always say witchcraft is political. I think witchcraft is very queer. It goes against the established doctrines that we're living under. Even when we had the cunning folk that were, going into folk practices, that was on a very kind of like community level, before communication homogenized everything, before globalization, before everything started to become the same and these ideas spread into every home. Everything was much more localized. Everything was much more specialized for the surrounding area and the forces of nature that you have to reckon with in those places. There wasn't, the establishment, the structure of society, that was something that the higher ups did. We didn't really have to worry about it that much unless they showed up for taxes and wanted one of our children or whatever it is that they do. For war. And so yeah, those are my thoughts, and I would love to hear yours in the comments. And until the next time, I hope we can hex the patriarchy together. I hope we can queer the patriarchy together. I hope we can
peg the patriarchy.
peg the patriarchy. Because there's need for it.